Hey, it's Drybear. And this time, 2 weeks have come and went, so it's time to check in on our DPS specialization rankings for Dragonflight week 13. If you found value in the video, leave a like down below. It helps me out tremendously. Subscribe if you want more gaming content. And as always, come by my live stream. I'm live every day, twitch.tv/Drybear. Be there or be a lemon. And we'll start like we always do by looking back on the stats we had before. So I missed week 12. I had some real life stuff going on that I had to take care of. So we're back on it now. We're skipping week 12 and we're going right into week 13. So the numbers you see on screen are week 11, 2 weeks ago, where the DPS landed. The one thing that I'm most curious about here is how the elemental single target DPS buffs affected elemental on these charts. And we'll see when we go into the next one. We know there's some pretty big changes coming for a lot of specs going into 10.0.7, some Warlock changes, some Mage changes, some Hunter changes in general, some interesting stuff. We'll see what things lined up. We identified Frost DKs. We know Ret Paladins are getting completely retconned. They're getting, pun intended, they're getting reworked quite a bit going into 10.0.7, which is next week. Get excited. But these are the numbers for week 11. Let's check out week 13. And boom, here we are, week 13, 2 weeks later from the data you just looked at. Again, this is the 95th percentile for DPS in Mythic Plus, Mythic Raid, and Heroic Raid, pulled directly from Warcraft logs. For anyone who asks, I get asked every time where this data comes from. It's all online. You can find it from the parses, warcraftlogs.com. I just put it into one sheet, so you don't have to go look at all the images yourself. So here we are. Let's look at the classes, the specs, and the details. We'll get down to the one thing I wanted to keep an eye on, but let's see how things have changed for the DPS specs in week 13. Starting with the number one place for, I think, 3 weeks in a row, Shadow Priest. I'm going to say it every time until this changes, but I am still baffled that Shadow Priest got buffed twice in a row. It is like, it historically has always been the case for Shadow Priests, where they are slow to start in the season. They are so stat reliant. They have so many breakpoints in their haste and how their kit works that they always shine mid to late season. So I'm shocked that they did so many buffs on them before they hit that runway where they take off. And here we are. So Shadow, like, several weeks in a row, they are number one overall. They are number 2 in Mythic Plus, which is a huge improvement for them. Historically, Mythic Plus was where they did slightly less than the best. They were usually ranging from 5th to like 8th, but in this case, 2nd place overall. It could be some of the things we're seeing in the MDI are inspiring people, or people are just figuring out how to use it, or they're just trying to get the most out of the Shadow. But for probably the first time in a while, Shadow Priest is in the top 2 for Mythic Plus, even beating out the likes of Balanced Druid, Fire Mage, and Outlaw Rogue, only losing to Subtlety Rogue. In Mythic Raid, they parsed higher than anyone else. Their damage output in Mythic Raid is bonkers. And then in Heroic Raid, they were in the top 3rd. I think this is pretty typical. In Heroic Raid, we tend to see the skill ceiling and skill floor, natural inheritance for each class show its ugly head, right? If a class is a little bit harder to play, it tends to do better in Mythic Raid and then worse in Heroic Raid overall, just because the player base that is parsing in those difficulties is slightly different, so you'll just get different results. But they're still up there in the top. They can still parse like crazy, and when you rely on them, they're amazing. So Shadow takes the first slot this week. And in 2nd overall, for the first time since Dragonflight, Arms Warrior. They were 2nd overall in Mythic Raid, 4th overall in Heroic Raid, and in the bottom of the top 3rd for Mythic Plus. But realistically, not that far behind. They're only really being significantly beaten by the top 4 classes, top 4 specs for Mythic Plus, but in general, Arms taking 2nd. So Arms Warriors rejoice. Fury definitely didn't get that, but Arms got a lot of love in December and January, and it paid off. Like they're killing it, man. They're doing so good in Raid overall, and it's a good feeling. It's a good thing to see. They were struggling for the longest time, and we'll see. I mean, kind of interesting. 2-handed plateware, Arms at the top, 2-handed plateware, Retribution at the bottom. So we'll see what 10.0.7 does for this spread, but Arms takes 2nd overall. 3rd overall is Subtlety, primarily because of their Mythic Plus score. They got a perfect 100 this week, outscoring everyone. In fact, the best spec for DPS you can bring for any Mythic Plus of any difficulty is Subtlety Rogue. I'm actually shocked that Outlaw has been just losing overall to Subtlety in that case, but Subtlety has just been dominating. We've seen it in the MDI. We've seen it in normal polls. Any key level, Subtlety just wins. They are about average in Heroic Raid, and then they are top 4 for Mythic Raid. So again, when the difficulty goes high and you have a good player behind the wheel, Subtlety kills it. When you can, cheat it and do as much parsing. They don't parse as highly as some of the monsters that parse really high in Heroic Raid, but when you take those monsters and you make them do mechanics, the DPS overall, Subtlety beats them out. So pretty cool to see that in general. Underneath Subtlety is Fire Mage. This still shocks me every time that, or I guess blasts me every time that we see it, because Arcane was #1 in the season. Frost and Fire were liquid hot garbage for a while, maybe 2 months at the start of the season, and we're just seeing Fire back in it. In fact, if you see Heroic Raid right now, all 3 mage specs are in the top 6 for Heroic Raid. So they're doing damage, finally. So historically, we've always seen Fire Mage do well in Mythic Plus. Their kit, the proc-based and bonus damage and burst windows works great for Mythic Plus timing, and they're able to kind of keep procs moving, right? When you have no downtime with Fire Mage, it feels really good because you're getting those procs and you're getting your hot streaks and you're burning. So when you're in Mythic Plus, especially at high keys where you're always pulling aggressively, Fire loves it. It's super fun. So they're top 4 for Mythic Plus. They didn't do as well this week in Mythic Raid, but they still did great in Heroic Raid, which means that, maybe they have trouble when they have to switch targets to ads, or when there's a, platform mechanics where you drop combat or you can't target and maintain your stacks and your procs. They're having trouble with that. But in other cases, they're doing just fine, which is what you'd expect from Fire, to be honest. Unholy DK, #5 overall, primarily because I'm telling you right now, if you had just a target dummy and every buff in the game and no distractions, Unholy DK beats everyone. And we've seen this in the MDI. If you get like a massive 40 mob pull, Unholy DK beats everyone. Their damage is stupid when they can get everything just right, but they're still a DK. They're still rather slow moving. Their cooldowns sometimes don't line up. They have some longer cooldowns. You can see that in Mythic Raid, where difficulty and mechanics matter, Unholy is towards the bottom 3, and then Mythic Plus, they're about halfway. And I think primarily because if you look at the large population, Unholy isn't really being utilized to its fullest, in that Unholy excels in Mythic Plus when the pulls are bonkers big, massive, ridiculous, you pull 50 mobs into the boss. That's when Unholy goes crazy. If you're pulling normal pack to pack, Unholy is about average in Mythic Plus, but as you go higher and higher, they do really well. Frost Mage in the 6th place overall, primarily because their Heroic Raid performance. They still can parse like crazy, absolute crazy. I actually need to look into what builds are being run right now for Frost Mage in Raid specifically, because I'm curious where things are lining up right now. I just started leveling my mage about a week ago, so I'm kind of curious to see what the meta is now for the talent choices on how that stacks up for single target. Mythic Plus, nothing too surprising there. They're about average. They aren't as reliant or they aren't as on-demand useful like Fire is, and it's harder for them to maintain their momentum from pack to pack when it comes to Frost relative to Fire, but they can still do the damage as seen by the Heroic Raid parses, so that's really exciting for them. Enhancement Shaman just underneath Frost Mage, again because of their Mythic Plus. They just like rogues and DHs and like Windwalkers, they love having that high momentum in Mythic Plus, and they still do amazingly well. They also provide Wind Fury if they spec into it for your top performers here like Feral, Outlaw. Havoc doesn't benefit too much from Wind Fury, but it is nice to have. Subtlety, Windwalker, Arms Warrior, Fury Warrior, they love that. So that's really cool to see them up there. And we love seeing Enhancement work out. They're getting some changes for PvP in 10.0.7, and I'm curious to see how that's going to affect them. They want Enhancement Shamans to be less bursty and more sustained damage in PvP, which I don't know. Like, I have some reservations about that just because they're generally, if you play Enhancement at a decent level in Arena, you spend a lot of time running after people, and I like the feeling personally of like being able to mess them up when I finally arrive and I stop being kited for 2 seconds. So if they make it more sustained damage, I'm worried that that's not going to feel as good, but we'll see. They've been testing internally. We'll see what they come up with. Balanced Druid underneath Enhancement, primarily because of their Mythic Plus scoring. We know that they just have double Starfall. They have tons of good AoE damage. They also have Battle Res, and they can do, their Roar that keeps everyone moving. They got all kinds of things. They can stealth, which is useful for a lot of situations, right? If you run like a mage, a druid, and a rogue, you don't even have to shroud most of the time. Everyone can stealth or invis, skip mobs, pack everything together. It's good stuff. So they're in a great spot in general. Underneath Balanced Druid is Havoc Demon Hunter, who honestly, they haven't changed. Like, I feel like every week we check in, Havoc is in the same spot. The only reason they're not in the top 5 like they started out the season as is because other people have been getting buffed. They've just been the same. Like, they've just been old reliable, old faithful. They're just good. They're reliable. They're fast. Their rotations are on a good time frame. A lot of them are 2 minutes instead of 3 minutes, so everything feels good. Yeah, man. Like, it's just Havoc's good. They're not struggling in any major way. They do have some troubles with the cheater hacker heroic raid where you can parse like crazy. But in Mythic Raid and Mythic Plus, when difficulty goes higher, it's kind of like a step ladder for them. Everything works great. I don't really have anything new to say about Havoc. They haven't really received any changes, and I guess they haven't really needed to. They're just good, man. They're not stellar, but they're great. That's it. Arcane Mage underneath Havoc, primarily because of their heroic raid performance. I would say if you took heroic raid out of the picture, Arcane would probably be in the struggle bus category, or at least they're in line to board the struggle bus. In general, they've got their lunchbox and they're ready to get on board because they're just kind of at that point now where they did get some nerfs, and maybe those nerfs were premature, but it was a long time ago, and maybe they're just not scaling well. It's kind of like maybe the Fury Warrior problem, where they just, over time, they haven't been gaining strength with better and more perfect gear and stat weighting, that they just start to fall behind. They do fine in Heroic Raid, but that just means that if they can stand on their Rune of Power and ignore everyone and everything, they can do great damage, but obviously that's unrealistic. So, maybe Arcane needs a little bit of love, but they're definitely not in the bottom echelon, but they're in the bottom third for sure. Devastation Evoker is still doing better than they were. They're doing excellent in Mythic Raid, and we're actually seeing some cool performance of Devastation in Mythic Plus. So even though last week, week 13, Devastation is towards the bottom, we're still seeing some ridiculous stuff from Devastation Evokers in the MDI, which is cool and encouraging and exciting. They do great in Mythic Raid. Single target, if you know how to manage your essences and your cooldowns, and you can save things. There's like the one thing that I think is the hardest part to master Devastation, at least on my Devastation Evoker, is getting that there's like this 10-second window where your cooldowns are coming off cooldown, and you have to make a quick decision on how you're going to use them. You can't just, like most DPS specs, just use them on cooldown and run them. You need to line up a bunch of windows to get everything just right, to get the most amount of damage out of your longer cooldowns. And if you can do that, it ends up being a pretty significant increase in your DPS. So that's why I would argue that in the large population, why Devastation is doing lower in Heroic Raid and Mythic Plus, but doing better in Mythic Raid is they're hitting that window just right. But in general, I would say they're definitely in a good spot. They're above the halfway line. They do great in Mythic Raid. They can do well in Mythic Plus, as shown by the MDI. It's just for the general population, your average Devastation Evoker might just be average or below average, but when you get that excellent one, they do amazing. Outlaw Rogue in the middle here. They're doing excellent in Mythic Plus. They're still slipping in Raid. I mean, I would say slipping in general because they just haven't been performing as well in Heroic Raid. But when it comes to Mythic Raid, they're still in the, top 8 for that. Still in a good spot. They're still amazing in Mythic Plus. They just, I guess maybe everyone that plays Rogue is just playing Assassination and Heroic Raid and they're not doing other content. I don't know. Something weird is going on with Rogues in general. Comment down below, if you're a Rogue, what spec do you play? And why is there such a disparity in which specs get played and which content? It's kind of fascinating to see how disparate Rogue is over time. Beast Mastery in the dead center here for average. They do better in Heroic Raid and they do lower in Mythic Raid and Mythic Plus. Again, I think this is about just if you zoom out, this is where you expect Beast Mastery to be all the time. I think when the difficulty is lower and you have less requirements for mechanics, Beast Mastery should be one of the best specs in the game. If you can just sit and hit your windows and your kill commands and get everything right, their damage should be really good. And then it should be more of a skill ceiling thing to be able to use that kit properly in difficult content without losing DPS, managing your pets and your timers and all that. I think that's kind of where it should be. You can probably make an argument that maybe at the top end, Beast Mastery needs to come up slightly, but they're probably about where you expect them to be based on their kit design for Dragonflight. Underneath that is Fury Warrior. They've just been, I don't know, man. I still don't know what it is. I still haven't figured it out. I've had this discussion with many players and top players on why Fury is where they are right now. And I don't think I've ever heard something that just makes me feel like, yep, that's it. I feel like on paper, they should be doing better. They started the season as one of the best DPS in the entire game. And they've just been on this kind of slow descent downward. I would say that if it was a skill floor thing, that maybe you would see them higher in Mythic Plus than they are right now. They're still doing great with Arms Warriors in Mythic Raid. They do pretty poorly in Heroic Raid, and they do about average, sometimes below average in Mythic Plus. But I don't feel like there's enough reason for that to be the case. So I'm wondering what based on the data. Now I haven't played my Fury Warrior in a while, but based on the data, I would say that there's some kind of limiting mechanic in the way the Fury Warriors are designed that's preventing them from cresting a little bit higher. And I'm not sure what that is. I haven't figured it out yet. If you have, let me know. But I've talked to a lot of people. I still don't have anything that's convinced me that, yep, that's the reason. They're still good. I wouldn't say they're bad by any means. And if you play them well, you play them well. But there's something going on, something underneath the hood that I'm still looking for. Windwalker Monk underneath Fury Warrior. They do much better in Mythic Plus and Mythic Raid. This is probably one of their weaker Mythic Raid weeks in general compared to past weeks. And then Heroic Raid, they're a little bit lower than they were. It just seems like they're lower in Raid. They're slightly lower than Mythic Plus, but they're kind of in the same boat as Havoc Demon Hunter. They're good. They're good, and when you play them well, they're really good. You can rely on them. They have amazing toolkits for so many situations. They're even getting a little bit better in PvP going into next patch, which is cool. They're just, I don't know what it is. I guess if you just don't use your Fist of Fury properly, or you don't line up your combo windows properly, or you don't position yourself well, I'm not sure what it is, but they're just kind of in the same boat as Havoc. You'd actually see on, like, if you look at Havoc and Windwalker in Heroic Raid up to Mythic Raid up to Mythic Plus, they kind of have this same trend line of going upward in the rankings as you go between those pieces of content. Heroic Raid, they tend to do worse. Mythic Raid, they do better. And then Mythic Plus, they do even better. They're both very good at killing trash. But yeah, they're just good. They're just good. Not quite as good as Havoc, but they're good. Doesn't mean you can't excel. They're just awesome. Underneath Windwalker is Marksmanship Hunter, who has been in kind of a bit of limbo ever since they lost Double Tap, and their talents have been changing. They're getting more changes in 10.0.7, so we'll see where that crazy rodeo takes them. And I honestly, yeah, I'm just curious to see where they go. They are doing better in Mythic Raid. I would argue Marksmanship is one of the better specializations design-wise for Mythic Plus, so I'd like to see them higher than they are right now. I feel like their kit works well for competitive dungeon clearing, so that's probably a little bit lower. You would expect them to see them much higher in Mythic Raid than in Heroic Raid, because there's some fine-tuning that it's required from the players to maximize the value of marksmanship, but that's where we are with that. Feral Druid has been kind of yo-yoing a little bit. They've been about top third for difficult content, and then in the bottom half for Heroic Raid, or bottom third for Heroic Raid, pretty consistently. I think it depends on the week. Sometimes they drop lower, sometimes they go up a little higher. And generally, if you see them perform better in harder content and significantly worse in easier content, that just is a sign of a skill floor. It just means that they're harder to play than, on average, other specializations. So the people that are not meeting that skill floor, they're underperforming. And then if they can get above it, then you can do quite well. So Feral Druid's still quite reliable. The only reason they're lower on this chart is just because on average, Heroic Raid, Feral Druid does quite poorly, and that's lowering their overall score, but they're great in every other category, which tells you that it comes down to the player, not necessarily the specialization. Assassination Rogue is kind of the reverse, actually. They're the complete opposite of Feral Druid. They do amazing in Heroic Raid. So if you got a friend that plays Assassination and you can just give them earbuds and they can go attack the boss and ads spawn and they say, I'm above that. I'm royalty. I don't have to do ads. And then there's like a mechanic where you have to go like kick something. They're like, I don't do that. I just attack the boss. They can parse like crazy. And that's always been the case. And that hasn't changed. But then when you ask them to do their chores, right, they have to take out the trash and wash the dishes. All of a sudden their damage performance is quite poor. So that's where they've been the whole time. That there hasn't really been anything significant that has changed that for them. That's been the state of the union for Assassination Rogue this season. They're just great in Heroic Raid and quite poor everywhere else. Demonology Warlock. Now, when it comes to Warlocks, they're actually all in the same boat here towards the bottom. Demonology, Affliction, and Destruction. But there's some big changes coming for them on Tuesday for 10.0.7. So we'll see where that lands them. In general, Demonology is getting some cool ones. I hope it's enough. We see them doing better in Mythic Raid, but better meaning just kind of average. They can still parse well, but you know, it's kind of a toss-up anytime you get a Warlock right now, whether or not they're going to bring big damage. I've seen Warlocks perform the best in Mythic Plus, and that's irrespective of their spec. I've done high keys with Affliction, Demonology, and Destruction Warlocks that have all killed it. And you know, if I was playing DPS, I struggled to keep up. If I was playing healer, they were like dominating. If I was playing tank, they were pulling aggro. So I've seen them do the best there. I've yet to see a Warlock top the meters in Raid though. We can see that Affliction is in the top third for Heroic Raid, but when difficulty comes into play, they're towards the absolute bottom. Destruction does better than the other specs in Mythic Plus, but they do worse than the other specs in Heroic Raid and Mythic Raid. And then Demonology is kind of like average or slightly below average across the board. Underneath the Warlocks is Survival Hunter. They came up off the floor. The 5% buff they got was useful, but I would argue it's not enough. They do okay, just above average in Heroic Raid, and they're towards the bottom in Mythic Raid and Mythic Plus. I don't know if the changes they're getting are going to be enough. I'm not really sure exactly what you would want to change with them. I feel like they're on that edge where it's possible that even just quality of life changes for survival would be enough to bring them up. Like things like making Harpoon easier to work into your rotation, like even just shortening the minimum range for Harpoon, where you could step back, use it, and get back in without having to step several steps back. Or maybe like wildfire windows becoming a little bit easier to manage, or maybe you can control, what kind of wildfire it is. You can do the bleeds more often, or you can do the AoE bursts, or your butchery could be a little bit more controllable. I feel like they're not far off from being amazing. It's possible there's just some little changes there, but I would say that these stats do suggest that survival still needs some more love than they've been receiving. On to Elemental Shaman, the one we were curious about from 2 weeks ago. It worked, more or less. I mean, Elemental Shaman's been down at the bottom for a while. They've just been struggling since the start of the season. Their damage is pretty hard to deal with, and we have talked about this many times on this channel. Elemental Shamans have the problem that it's hard for them to be able to do all styles of content because their tree is designed in such a way where you kind of have to commit to either doing single target or AoE or utility. And when you commit to one, it weakens the others. And each one of those commits, those like committals, require different stat weightings. So the gear you equip and the specs you have, it's like, it's almost like, you try to wash one counter, and by doing so, you make another counter dirty, and you can't, like everything just gets messed up when they have that. But they did get a damage increase for single target primarily. Ice Fury got some nice changes. They got some nice changes for Lava Burst and some procs, which are pretty cool. And that did help them tremendously in Mythic Raid. They were above the halfway line. They beat out Havoc, Demon Hunter. They tied Feral and Outlaw. They're pushing up on Hunters. So that single target helped tremendously. It didn't help them too much in Heroic Raid, which tells me that maybe you needed a better gear, or you needed a little bit more. It requires more effort to get the most out of it, but it did have a nice impact for them in Mythic Raid. And shockingly enough, it helped them in Mythic Plus as well, which is pretty cool. We love to see that. It didn't help them too much, but just a little bit. Maybe it's, just on tyrannical weeks, it gives you a little bit extra oomph on the boss, but it's nice to see. And we'll see what happens to them going to the next patch, but at least there was a positive impact for them in the situation they're in now. Frost DK is kind of the opposite. They received some damage buffs, and then they received some damage buffs again. Didn't really seem to do a whole lot for them. They're still parsing like crazy in Mythic Raid, but they're just still at the bottom in every other style of content, which tells me that they have like this, you know, pinpoint bullseye that if they hit it and do everything perfectly with every global, with a perfect group that's doing the mechanics perfectly, they can do well. But in a realistic scenario, when you're playing with pugs and things are going wrong and you have to make up for things or adjust, they fall flat. And I think they still need some love going into the next big patch, if not 10.0.7, 10.1 at the very least. And at the bottom, we got to put an asterisk next to Retribution. They've been at the bottom for a long time, but they're going to be born anew going into 10.0.7 on Tuesday. They're just a different class. There's so much going on. Their class tree is changing. Their spec tree is changing. Their passives are changing. The way their abilities work is changing. All of their scalings is changing. Everything's changing. So who knows what Retribution is going to be like. The testing that I've done on BTR and what I've seen of other people testing, it looks good. They've done some nice, cool things for Retribution. Obviously, proof is in the pudding. We'll see what happens to them when they actually get onto live servers with real groups on mass, with lots of parses, what happens to them. But I don't know if it's worth talking about where they're at. They're still bad, but we'll see what happens next week. So that's the DPS rankings for week 13. I'm back. I was working on stuff, but we're back. We're making content. So thanks for sticking with me, and I hope you enjoyed the video. And I'll see you guys next week for the next check-in. All of that business. Pop by my live stream. I'm live every day. Twitch.tv/Drybear. See you there. If you enjoyed yourself today, leave a like down below. You can support me and my work on Patreon and view Patreon exclusive content. Link in the description. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.